text at the beginning of the week, I kept reminding myself, turned into Popeye somehow. I kept reminding myself that I like using the lectionary. I like using the lectionary. It makes me look at text that I just love. Difficult text for us. Jesus is using hyperbole in this text. Please don't go home and cut your arms off. Don't go home and gouge out your eyes, cut your foot off. He was making a point how serious this really is. He's bringing out the seriousness of what he's trying to say. There's quite a few things in that one text we just read, those portions of that chapter we just read. I'm only going to look at one small area of that. As you can see, the title of the message this morning is, You Never Know Who Is Watching. In the gospel lesson last week, Jesus took a child in his arm and he said, in his arms, and he said, "Whoever welcomes such a child in my name welcomes me." And we talked around what that meant to welcome children, how they were the powerless, those who were unable to do something for us, and welcome was a sense of radical hospitality, how we brought people in and how we treated people, even if they couldn't do anything for us, especially if they can't return the favor to us. And we talked around that kind of language. This week, Jesus sounds as if he's still talking about children. He says, "If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea." Well, there's one thing that's clear. It's not a good thing to cause the little ones to stumble. I think we can get that from the image of the millstone around the neck and being thrown into the sea. It's not a good thing. However, in all of the research that I've done on this text and every commentary that I've looked at, everybody is in agreement on one thing, that Jesus is no longer talking about children. He's not talking about children. The little ones that they believe he's talking about are new believers, those who are fresh in the faith, those who weren't mature yet in their faith. These are the ones that Paul writes about in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, about still drinking the milk of the gospel and not yet ready for solid food. New Christians, perhaps, or people whose faith is fragile and not fully established, not well established yet. When I read this, it reminded me of a true story. I didn't witness this myself, but it was told to me. I know some of you are familiar with the Navy, and the routine of the Navy is if you're aboard a ship, if you're stationed on a ship, you can be pretty much guaranteed in your 3 years of being aboard that ship that you will be out for at least a year. Is that about right? 2 6-month trips in 3 years, or is it more than that? George?
9 months of a year.
About 9 months every year and a half. You're out to sea. You're out to sea. And most of that's done in 6-month increments where you're out to sea. You're going to foreign ports. Well, there's one story that I heard told. What happens occasionally when you go out in foreign ports is that they've been on ship a long time, and some of the crew will go out to the town and they will act immoral. They won't do the right thing. Now, most sexually transmitted diseases commonly caught can be handled with penicillin. And so the story is that on these ships, usually the next day after a port call, there's a long line outside the clinic through the passageway, and people wait to get the penicillin shot. Well, the story I heard was about the ship's chaplain, who seemed to find himself in that line almost every time as well. Probably a good example of what Jesus was talking about here, putting a stumbling block in the way of somebody who's coming into the faith. Somebody would look at that and say, why would I want to be a Christian? What difference does it seem to make in the lives of these individuals as they seek to follow after Jesus Christ? Acting immorally and doing things that Jesus described, cutting your hand in your eye and your foot off and out and gouging and all that. Doing something that would make these people stumble. I find it interesting that this is the only reference to hell in this gospel. It's the only reference to hell in this gospel. And Jesus is warning who? Who's in the group that he's teaching? His disciples. It's the disciples he's talking to. He's warning his disciples against putting a stumbling block in front of these little ones who believe in me. not the crowds he's talking to in this case. I found that to be fairly interesting. Remember, Jesus is taking the disciples aside and is talking directly to them about what it means to follow after him. There are disagreements between the denominations as to whether or not one can lose their salvation after they have entered into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. In the Wesleyan tradition, we talk about backsliding. At least that was the old language. I don't know if we still use that terminology or not. But when I was growing up, we talked about backsliding. The United Methodist Church is in the Wesleyan tradition. We believe that it is possible to lose our salvation, and this is one of the texts that we use to support our position on that. My own personal interpretive rule is that the Scripture will never warn you not to do something that it's impossible for you to do. You know what I'm saying? My own personal interpretive rule is that when you read a warning in Scripture not to do something, it probably means that it is an option. Or why would they warn you not to do it? I mean, it's something that you could do. Or why would the warning be there? It wouldn't make sense. Today's text, it is both the stumbling Christian and the Christian who causes others to stumble that are subject to judgment. And Jesus is warning the disciples, his closest followers, about this. We need to take note. We need to listen carefully. There's another good example of how one might cause an immature Christian to stumble in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, found in chapter 8. It has to do with meat sacrificed to idols. There were pagan temples in Corinth, and they conducted animal sacrifices. After the animals were sacrificed, the temple made the meat available for sale. You could go to the temple, you could buy this meat, and you could have it for your dinner. Because the temples only accepted the top quality animals, it was the best meat around, the best meat available. The Christians in Corinth were divided on whether or not they should be allowed to take this meat and to use it, to buy this meat. Some said we should eat the meat that's been sacrificed to pagan gods. Some said we shouldn't eat the meat. And others said we aren't worshiping pagan gods, we're just buying good food. And the temple's the place to get the best quality meat. And that's where we go to get it. So Paul weighs in his letter to the Corinthians, and he says that there is only one God. So pagan idols don't amount to anything. Christians could buy the meat at pagan temples. But there was something else to consider. You see, some not yet mature Christian might misunderstand if they saw a Christian leader standing in line at the pagan temple. They might think that the Christian leader was somehow worshiping at this temple as well, and it might cause them to lose their faith in Jesus. It might cause them not to come to the Christian faith. So what should Christians do? Should they feel free to eat meat sacrificed to idols or not? Paul's answer was that Christians could buy meat at pagan temples. They could eat it, they could serve it to their guests, no problem. But, and this is a big but they need to take care that this liberty, this is an exact quote from 1 Corinthians 8:9, take care that this liberty of theirs didn't somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Same language that Jesus is using in this gospel.